She was 20 years old, and she had almost nothing in the world, and the one thing she did have, the thing her family had given her as an insult, was half of a broken compass. Her name was Verity Ashford, and on the day her grandmother's estate was divided, in the parlor of the big house in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, her cousins took the land and the money and the good furniture, and to Verity, the poor relation, the charity case, the daughter of the son who had married beneath him and died young, they gave a small tin box, and in the box was half of an old brass compass, snapped clean in two, the needle gone, the face cracked. A worthless broken thing that had been her dead grandfather's, and they gave it to her laughing, as a joke. The poor girl's inheritance. Half of a broken compass that pointed nowhere. She had known it would be like this. Verity had grown up on the edge of the Ashford family, near it, but never quite in it, the daughter of the son who had disgraced himself by marrying a poor schoolteacher's daughter for love and dying young, and leaving his own daughter to the cold charity of relations who had never forgiven the marriage. She had been raised in the big house on sufferance, fed at the far end of the table, dressed in her cousin's outgrown clothes, reminded in 100 small daily ways that she was a burden the family carried and not truly one of them. And when the grandmother died, the last of the old generation, and the estate was gathered up to be divided among the heirs, Verity had known she would get little, and had told herself she did not care, and had almost believed it. But she had not expected to be mocked. She had not expected her cousin Frederick, the eldest, to hold up the little tin box before the whole gathered family and announce, with the laughter already in his voice, that dear cousin Verity should have something of grandfather's too, and to hand her, to the general amusement of the room, half of a broken compass. Verity took it without a word, and she did not let them see that her hand was shaking, and she did not let them see that she was not, in fact, insulted at all, but rather that her heart had begun to pound. Because Verity Ashford knew something about that broken compass that her laughing cousins did not. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Ashford, and the broken half of a compass, and the secret it led her to that had been sealed since the war. And if a story of an old wound and a patient granddaughter is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand why Verity's heart pounded at the sight of a broken compass, you have to understand her grandfather, and the war, and the thing that had happened to the Ashford family 60 years before that had shadowed every year since. Verity's grandfather had been a man named Josiah Ashford, and he had been, before the war, the master of a prosperous farm in the Shenandoah, a man of standing and substance. And then the war had come. The great war between the states that had rolled back and forth across the Shenandoah Valley for 4 terrible years. For the valley had been the breadbasket of the Confederacy and the highway of its armies, and the ground fought over more bitterly than almost any in the country. And Josiah Ashford's farm had been in the path of it. Twice armies had camped on his land. Twice it had been foraged bare. And in the last year of the war, when the valley was put to the torch in the great burning that was meant to starve the armies out, the Ashford farm had burned with the rest. The barns, and the mills, and the fences. And Josiah Ashford had come out of the war a ruined man, his land laid waste, his fortune gone. Verity had grown up hearing of those years, for they had marked the whole valley and every family in it, and the old people spoke of the burning the way people speak of a flood or a plague, as a thing that divided all of time into before and after. There had been a season, in that last terrible year, when the sky over the Shenandoah was black with the smoke of burning barns from one end of the valley to the other, when the armies took what they wanted and destroyed the rest, when a family might go to bed prosperous and wake in the morning ruined, their granaries ash, their stock driven off, their fences burned for campfires. It was into that chaos and terror that the families of the valley had done the thing that made the Ashford tragedy. Fearing the looting that came with the armies, a dozen families had gathered up their most precious things, the silver and the coin and the jewelry that generations had accumulated, everything small and valuable that could be carried and hidden, and had brought it all to the one man among them they trusted most to keep it safe, the strongest and most respected man in that corner of the valley, Josiah Ashford, and had begged him to hide it against the armies until the danger passed. And Josiah Ashford had taken up that trust, as a strong man does, and had hidden their treasure, and had meant to give it back when the danger was over. And that simple act of being trusted had become, through fever and fire and suspicion, the ruin of his name. But that was not the wound. The whole valley had suffered so, ruin was common as grass after that war. The particular wound of the Ashford family, the thing that had shadowed them for 60 years, was this, that Josiah Ashford had lost, in the war, not only his fortune, but his good name. For it was said, and had been said ever since, that in the chaos of those last days, when the armies were breaking and the valley burning, Josiah Ashford had been entrusted with something and had betrayed the trust. It was said that he had been given the safekeeping of a great sum, the pooled valuables of his neighbors, the plate and the coin and the jewelry of a dozen valley families who had entrusted their treasures to the strongest man among them for hiding against the looting armies, and that when the war ended and the families came to reclaim what they had entrusted to him, Josiah Ashford had told them it was gone, taken by soldiers, lost in the burning, and that not one of them had ever believed him. They had believed, instead, that he had kept it, hidden it, meant to keep it for himself, and the suspicion had never been proven and never been dispelled, and it had ruined Josiah Ashford as surely as the fire had ruined his fields. His neighbors had turned from him. The families whose treasures were lost had passed their bitterness down to their children, and the Ashfords, though they had slowly rebuilt some of their fortune in the generations since, had never rebuilt their name, and had lived 60 years under the shadow of the belief that their grandfather had been a thief who robbed his neighbors in their hour of need. Josiah Ashford had gone to his grave protesting his innocence, and no one had believed him, and the shame of it had passed down through his children, and had reached, at last, his granddaughter Verity, the poor relation, who had loved the memory of the grandfather she never knew, and who had heard, from her own father before he died, the one thing that made her heart pound at the sight of a broken compass. For Verity's father, Josiah's youngest son, had told her, when she was a girl, that the old man had not been a thief. He had sworn it. And he had told her that Josiah, on his deathbed, had said a strange thing, a thing the family had taken for the wandering of a dying mind, but that Verity's father had never forgotten, that the truth was not lost, that he had hidden it where it would keep, that he had not been able to prove it in his lifetime, because the proof was hidden and the finding of it required two halves that had been separated, and that one day, when the halves came together, the truth would come out, and the Ashford name would be cleared. He had not been believed. He had died, and the strange words had been forgotten by most, and the broken compass, which had been among his effects, had been kept only as a worthless keepsake, passed down the generations, its meaning lost, until it came to be given, as a joke, to the poor granddaughter at the dividing of the estate. But Verity's father had told her the other thing, the thing that turned the joke inside out. He had told her that Josiah Ashford's dearest friend before the war, the one man who had stood by him after, when all the valley turned away, had been a man named Cornelius Bell, and that Josiah and Cornelius had been closer than brothers, and that when Cornelius Bell died, some years after Josiah, his family too had kept among his effects a broken half of a brass compass, the very twin and match of the Ashford half, and that the two old friends had each carried half of one compass all their lives, and no one had ever known why. Verity Ashford, standing in the parlor with the broken half of the compass in her shaking hand, understood in a rush what 60 years had hidden. Josiah Ashford had said the truth required two halves that had been separated, and here was one half, given to her as a joke, and the other half, if it still existed, was with the descendants of Cornelius Bell. and Verity understood that her grandfather had not raved on his deathbed. He had left a message, split in two, one half with each of two friends, so that neither half alone meant anything, and only the joining of the two would reveal the truth, and he had done it that way she would come to understand, for a reason that was the whole heart of the story. So Verity Ashford took her worthless broken half of a compass, and she left her laughing cousins to their land and their money, and she set out to do the thing no Ashford in 60 years had thought to do, to find the other half, and join them, and clear her grandfather's name. The finding of the Bell family was the first work, and it took Verity the better part of a year, for the Bells had scattered in the 60 years since Cornelius died, and Verity had almost no money and no standing, and only a poor girl's stubbornness to spend on the search. But she was patient, and she was determined, and she followed the trail of the Bell family through old church records and older memories, from the Shenandoah, where they had started, to a farm in the Virginia Piedmont, and from there to a small town where the last of the line, an old woman named Charlotte Bell, lived alone, the granddaughter of Cornelius, the last keeper of the Bell family's memory and effects. It was a hard year, that search, and there were many times Verity nearly gave it up. She left the big house within the week, for there was nothing to keep her there but scorn, and she took work where she could find it, sewing and keeping other people's account books, for she had a good hand and a good head for figures, and she spent what little she earned and what little time she could spare on the hunt for the Bells. She wrote letters that went unanswered. She spent her few coins on stagecoach fares to towns where the trail went cold. She sat in the back rooms of country churches, turning the brittle pages of baptism and burial registers by the light from a dusty window, following the Bell name forward through the generations, a marriage here, a death there, a family splitting and moving and dwindling across 60 years of a changing country. More than once the trail seemed to vanish entirely, and she sat with the useless broken half of the compass in her hand and wondered whether she was as foolish as her cousins thought her, chasing a dead man's riddle across the state with nothing to go on but a story her father had told her and a faith she could not quite explain even to herself. But something in her would not let it go. She had loved her father, and her father had sworn the old man was no thief, and Verity had decided, somewhere in that hard year, that she would rather spend her whole life chasing the proof of it than live comfortably under a lie. And so she went on, town by town, register by register, until the trail led her at last to the small town and the small house where old Charlotte Bell lived alone. And when Verity Ashford found Charlotte Bell and told her who she was and why she had come, she found that the old woman had been waiting, in a manner of speaking, for 60 years. For Charlotte Bell, too, had been told a story by her elders, the mirror of Verity's own, that her grandfather Cornelius had kept, all his life, a broken half of a compass, the twin of one held by his ruined friend Josiah Ashford, and that Cornelius had said that the two halves together held a secret that would clear his friend's name, and that Cornelius had gone to his grave grieved that the joining had never happened, that the Ashford family and the Bell family had drifted apart in their shared troubles, and never brought the halves together, and that the truth Josiah had hidden had stayed hidden for want of two old friends' descendants ever sitting down in one room with the two halves of a broken compass. Charlotte Bell brought out the Bell half, and Verity Ashford brought out the Ashford half, and two old broken pieces of brass that had been apart for 60 years were laid together on a table, and they fitted, edge to edge. The two halves of one compass, snapped apart long ago and joined at last. It was a strange and solemn moment. The two women bent over the little table in the lamplight of Charlotte Bell's small parlor, two strangers who had been made kin by a dead man's design, watching the two halves of brass come together. Neither of them spoke, as Verity slid her half against Charlotte's and the broken edges met and matched, tooth for tooth, the way two pieces of one broken thing will match nothing else in all the world. There could be no doubt they were halves of one whole. The break itself was the proof, a jagged line that only its own other half could complete. And as they fitted together, The two women felt, both of them, the weight of the 60 years that had kept these halves apart, the long estrangement of two families that a dead man had meant to be joined, closing at last under their hands. And they were more than a compass. For when the two halves were fitted together, Verity and Charlotte saw what neither half alone could show, that inside the compass, in the hollow of its brass case, hidden in the space behind the works, was a chamber, and that the chamber could only be opened when the two halves were joined, for the mechanism of its opening was split between them, half the catch on the Ashford side and half on the Bell side, so that neither half alone could ever open it, and only the two together could. Josiah Ashford had built it so. He had taken a compass and hollowed it and hidden a thing inside and split it in two and given half to himself and half to his most trusted friend, so that the secret could never be opened by one alone, could never be found by a thief who got only one half, could never be forced or stolen or betrayed, but could only be revealed when an Ashford and a Bell, descendants of the two friends, came together in trust and joined the halves. It was a lock that required not a key but a friendship, renewed across the generations. And when Verity and Charlotte worked the split catch together, each moving her half as the joined mechanism required, the hidden chamber opened, and inside it, folded small and kept perfect for 60 years in its sealed brass heart, was a piece of paper, and on the paper, in Josiah Ashford's own hand, was the truth that had been sealed since the war. It was a map and a letter. The letter told the story that no one had believed. Josiah Ashford had not stolen his neighbor's entrusted treasure. He had hidden it, as he was charged to do, hidden it well against the looting armies, in a place only he knew. But before he could return it, the war had ended in chaos and fire, and Josiah had fallen gravely ill in the last weeks of the burning, near to death for many months, and by the time he recovered, a terrible thing had happened. He had lost the exact knowledge of where he had hidden it. The fever had taken his memory of the particular spot. He knew he had hidden the treasure, knew he had not stolen it, but the fever had burned away the precise location, and he could not produce it, and could not prove he had ever hidden it rather than kept it. And so he stood accused and could not clear himself, for the only proof of his innocence was the treasure itself, hidden where his own fevered mind could no longer find it. But Josiah Ashford had not given up. Over the years of his ruin, slowly, painfully, he had reconstructed it. He had gone back over his own movements in those last days of the war, had reasoned out where he must have gone, had searched and tested and remembered, a piece at a time across years, until at last, an old man, he had recovered the knowledge the fever had stolen. He had found again, in his mind and then on the ground, the place where his younger self had hidden the treasure of his neighbors. It had been the work of his ruined life, that reconstruction, and Verity understood, reading the letter, what it must have cost him. Year after year disgraced and shunned, an old man walking his own lost land, trying to retrace the steps of his younger self through a night 60 years gone, half remembered. Fever burned. He had made himself remember the weather of that night, the state of the roads, how long he had been gone, what he had carried and how heavy it was, and therefore how far he could have taken it. He had reasoned it out the way another man might solve a long sum, piece by piece, testing each recovered fragment of memory against the others until they fit, and he had dug, in secret, in the likely places, and been wrong, and dug again, for years, an old man with a spade in the moonlight searching his own ruined fields for the proof of his own innocence, while the valley watched and sneered and said, "There goes mad old Ashford, still pretending." And at last, near the very end of his life, he had found it, had stood again in the place his younger self had hidden the trust, and had known, with the certainty of a thing recovered from the very edge of loss, that he could prove at last what he had always been. And then, old and dying and wise in the ways of a valley that had turned on him, he had faced the final problem: how to reveal it in a way that would clear him rather than damn him further. And he had made this map, but by then he was old, and ruined and dying, and he knew that if he simply announced that he had found it, after all the years of suspicion, no one would believe he had not simply known all along, that the finding would look like a thief at last disgorging his loot, and would clear nothing. And more than that, he no longer trusted the valley that had turned on him. He feared that if he revealed the treasure openly, it might simply be seized, and the truth of his long innocence buried in the squabbling over the gold. So he had done the thing that was the whole heart of his character and the reason the story is worth telling. He had hidden the truth again, but this time on purpose, and this time in a way that would prove itself. He had put the map and the letter in the compass, and split the compass, and given half to himself and half to the one man who had never stopped believing him, Cornelius Bell, so that the truth could only ever come out through an act of trust between their families, an act that would itself be the proof of his innocence. For a thief does not build a lock that can only be opened by friendship. A thief hides his loot and keeps it. Josiah Ashford had built a puzzle whose very solving required two families to trust each other across the generations, and had thereby ensured that whoever finally opened it would understand, in the opening, what kind of man had built it. The manner of the hiding was itself the message: I was no thief. I hid what I was trusted to hide, and I have hidden the proof in trust, and only trust can bring it out. Verity Ashford and Charlotte Bell, the granddaughters of the two friends, sat together over the opened compass and the recovered map and wept, for they understood that they were the fulfillment of an old man's faith, the trust he had cast forward across 60 years. Sure that some day an Ashford and a Bell would come together and open what he had sealed, and vindicate him at last. They followed the map together. It led, as Josiah's letter had said, to a place on the old Ashford land, now owned by one of Verity's cousins, a dry stone spring-house half fallen in a wooded hollow, and beneath its floor. In a stone-lined chamber Josiah had built and sealed 60 years before was the treasure of the valley, exactly as he had hidden it, the plate and the coin and the jewelry of a dozen families entrusted to the strongest man among them, and hidden faithfully against the armies, and lost only to a fever, and found again by a dying man's patient love of his own good name. It was a strange procession that went out to the spring house, the two women together with the map between them, walking onto the land that had been Verity's grandfather's and was now her cousin Frederick's, the same cousin who had handed her the broken compass as a joke. They found the spring house just as the map showed it, a low mossy stone structure half collapsed in a green wooded hollow where a spring still trickled. A place so ordinary and so overgrown that a person might pass it 100 times and never think twice. And that was, Verity understood, exactly why her grandfather had chosen it. They cleared away the fallen stone and the years of leaf mold from the floor, and beneath it, where the map marked, they found the flat capstone Josiah had set, and they worked it up between them, and there below was the chamber, dry and stone-lined and sound, and in it the trunks and boxes and oilcloth-wrapped bundles that a faithful man had sealed away 60 years before. It had been there the whole time. 60 years. A mile from the houses of the families who had cursed the Ashford name. Sealed in a stone chamber under a fallen spring house, waiting for two halves of a broken compass to come together and reveal it. What followed cleared the Ashford name at last, 60 years too late for Josiah, but not too late for the truth. Verity and Charlotte brought the map and the letter and the treasure to the law and to the descendants of the dozen families whose valuables had been entrusted and lost. And the whole story came out, proven now beyond any doubt, for here was the treasure, unspent, untouched, exactly as it had been entrusted, hidden faithfully and not stolen. And here was the map and the letter in Josiah's own hand, and here was the compass split in trust between two friends, the whole architecture of an innocent man's long vindication. And the descendants of the families who had grown up hating the Ashford name learned that the man they had been taught to despise had been, all along, the most faithful of them, who had kept their treasure safe through fire and war, and had died disgraced rather than betray a trust, and who had loved his own honor so much that he had spent his ruined years reconstructing from a fever-burned memory the proof of his innocence, and had cast that proof forward across 60 years in the surest form he knew, the joined hands of two friends' grandchildren. The treasure was returned to the families of those it had belonged to, as Josiah Ashford had always meant it to be. And the Ashford name, which had meant thief in the Shenandoah for 60 years, was cleared and honored, and Josiah Ashford was remembered at last for what he truly was, not the man who robbed his neighbors, but the man who kept faith with them through everything, and lost everything for it, and never stopped trying to make the truth known. And Verity Ashford, the poor relation given a broken compass as a joke, was not left poor. The families whose treasure she had restored pressed rewards upon her, and the law awarded her a finder's portion, and more than the money, she was given back the thing her family had lost 60 years before, which was its honor, and that was worth more to Verity than all the land and money her laughing cousins had taken, for they had the estate, but she had the name, cleared and shining, and she found she did not envy them at all. But the thing Verity valued most out of all of it was not the money, and not even quite the clearing of the name. It was Charlotte Bell, for the two women, the last of the Ashfords and the last of the Bells, brought together by two halves of a broken compass, had become, in the working of it, exactly what their grandfathers had been, friends closer than family, bound by a shared trust. And they remained so all their lives. Josiah Ashford had built a lock that could only be opened by friendship, and in the opening of it he had not only cleared his name, but had reached across 60 years, and given his granddaughter a friend, had renewed between the Ashfords and the Bells the very bond that was the heart of his whole message, so that the friendship of two old men, broken by the troubles of their ruined years, was mended at last by their granddaughters over the joined halves of a compass. And that, Verity always said, was the truest treasure to come out of the spring-house, not the gold, but the friend. She had been 20 years old, and cast off with nothing but a worthless broken half of a compass, given to her as a cruel joke by cousins who thought her beneath them. It was the best inheritance she ever received. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the recovered treasure. Though, that was justice. It is that trust, real trust, is the one lock that cannot be picked, and the one key that cannot be stolen. Josiah Ashford, betrayed by a whole valley's willingness to believe the worst of him, did not answer their suspicion with more secrecy of the ordinary kind. A better hiding place, a stronger lock. He answered it with trust. He built a puzzle that could only be solved by an act of faith between two families, and he cast it forward 60 years, betting everything on the belief that some day an Ashford and a Bell would sit down together and choose to trust each other, and be proven right to. He was betting on the goodness of grandchildren he would never meet. And he won that bet. In a world that had shown him the worst of what people can be, he staked his last hope on the best of what they can be, and across 60 years, two women he never knew proved him right. So, we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Is there a broken friendship in your own family's past? An old bond between families or people that was lost to hard times, that someone somewhere might still be able to mend, and find a treasure in the mending? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.